main thrust of this program is to question the validity of the official record of mankind's exploration of the moon. Sending men to the moon and bringing them back safely is widely held to be the greatest technical achievement of mankind so far. In fact, the greatest achievement of the second millennium. But this story of Project Apollo presents an alternative viewpoint. The material you will see uncovers numerous inconsistencies in the official NASA record of manned missions to the moon. The anomalies presented bring into total question whether, over the period of 3 years from 1969, 12 named Apollo astronauts really did travel through deep space and walk upon the surface of our celestial neighbor, the moon. New evidence throws into serious doubt the authenticity of the Apollo record and suggests that NASA hoaxed the photographs taken on the surface of the moon. This aspect of the lunar photography is dealt with in Part 1. In Part 2, we will be looking at the dangers of space radiation that have to be overcome when journeying to and from the moon. And in Part 3, we examine the evolution of the rockets involved and the problems of getting astronauts and all their equipment out to the moon and back, alive and well. This production is the result of painstaking and extensive research. You will hear the testimony of many people from various disciplines, including those who can be described as whistleblowers. These are individuals who have spoken out or left a legacy of clues. In a 1959 report to the US House of Representatives, rocket engineer Wernher von Braun stated that manned orbit of the moon would not occur before 1969, and that a manned lunar landing would only follow years later. The NASA administrators and their contractors, North American Aviation, were firmly of the opinion that until at least the early 1970s, only unmanned instrumentation would be probing the lunar surface and its environment.
In 1959, I was working with advanced research at Rocketdyne, and they did a study on the statistical probability of landing a man on the moon and returning him, and it was something like 0.0014. This was taking into account the Van Allen radiation belt, solar flares, micrometeorites, all of the numerous hazards that astronauts would encounter and the possibility of failure. So obviously, when I heard that in 1959, I pretty much got the idea that going to the moon was a real risky thing.
Despite these and other expert opinions, 2 years later, President Kennedy officially set America on the road to the moon. Given the fully acknowledged relatively primitive state of 1960s technology, we are going to investigate the dramatic progress and the many claims made by the Apollo space program.
I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal, before this decade is out, of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth. No single space project in this period will be more impressive to mankind or more important for the long-range exploration of space.
This program will show that real live astronauts were sent on the high-risk journey to the moon, but they were not the now famous named astronauts who in all probability never left Earth orbit. In this way, they avoided exposure to the hazardous and even lethal radiation of deep space by remaining below the zones of radiation that encircle Earth, and of course staying well within the Earth's magnetic field, which contributes to the protection of our planet. Even in our present state of technology at the dawn of this new millennium, potentially lethal radiation awaits all those who venture through the Van Allen radiation belts into deep space, whether they be en route to the moon, to Mars or beyond. So did Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, Ed Mitchell and their named comrades sacrifice their personal integrity on the altar of NASA's reputation? Did other unnamed astronauts sacrifice their lives? And if so, for what reason? Was it to cover for the fact that in the late 60s it was not possible to guarantee the safe return to Earth of the Apollo astronauts? Such a scenario would answer that inevitable question, why? and justify the serious anomalies in the official record which this investigation reveals. Dr. Ian Crawford is a research astronomer for the Department of Physics and Astronomy at University College London.
In our history, we've done a lot of things, but we have also done some things which are truly great, like building the pyramids, like building the cathedrals in medieval Europe, and like putting people on the moon in the 1960s. I mean, these were tremendous achievements for their time.
Could it be the case that NASA publicly stated that it was doing things one way, when in fact plans were in place to proceed in a very different manner? Was it realized very early on that apart from the unpredictable radiation hazards and the massive technological challenges, the lunar environment itself, without an atmosphere and certainly no winds, created yet another set of insurmountable problems?
Maybe it'll, that's what it looks like, it's waving in a breeze.
How many times can a man turn his head and pretend that he just doesn't see? The answer, my friend, is blowing in the wind. The answer is blowing in the wind. Yes, and how many deaths will it take till he knows that too many people have died? The answer, my friend, is blowing in the wind. The answer is blowing in the wind.
Like many of us, David Percy was overjoyed at the sight of Armstrong apparently stepping onto the lunar surface in July 1969. David is an award-winning film and television producer, as well as a professional photographer and associate of the Royal Photographic Society.
A representative of mankind may well have gone to the moon in 1969, but our research suggests that images of the Apollo landings are not a true and accurate record of such an event. In our view, the Apollo pictures were faked. Many were also encoded with deliberate mistakes. In the years following the Apollo missions, it became increasingly clear to us that there were also errors in the continuity between the live TV coverage and the still photographs. Many of the images are replete with inconsistencies and anomalies. These anomalies and errors may well have been deliberately introduced by whistleblowers. The view of co-author Mary Bennett and myself is that these whistleblowers were individuals deeply unhappy with the fraud they were perpetrating. They in all likelihood created the errors in the anticipation that one day these mistakes would be discovered and exposed. Now, back in the Apollo days, in order to record the original broadcast material for posterity, it had to be filmed off TV screens during the live enactment of each Apollo mission. Now, following the recently completed transfer of all that film onto videotape, it's now been possible to study this film in its entirety, something, incidentally, that relatively few people have done. And furthermore, there's added irony in the fact that new evidence suggests that the original broadcast material wasn't live at all, but actually consisted of pre-recorded video programming. We've come full circle.
Talk us through an example or two of errors in continuity between the Apollo TV coverage and still photographs of the same event.
A serious continuity error can be found in the last but one mission, Apollo 16 of 1972. Let's take a look at a clear discrepancy in the record. We've dubbed this the jump salute. When the astronaut reaches the peak of his jump, his colleague takes a snap with the Hasselblad stills camera. Let's ignore the reasons as to why such a small jump in the much reduced 1/6 gravity of the moon, and continue instead with the discontinuities revealed by these images. This is the resulting Hasselblad photograph of that event. The most significant difference between these two images of the same action is that in a still photo there's a triangle of fabric that should be absolutely secure and motionless that has flapped up from the top of the plis, the personal life support system, as the astronaut jumps into the air. In the TV freeze frame we can see this triangular flap is correctly fastened and is therefore not visible. It's not flapped up. If it had done so, it would be very obvious in this rear view, the TV image. You can see the size and detail of the triangular flap from this view of the top of the plis. How could this part of the vital life support pack not be correctly fastened in place on a real Apollo situation on the Moon? In any event, actions taking place simultaneously, such as TV and stills photography of the same event and the same time, must show the same detail. Both versions cannot be correct. In other words, this piece of TV footage and this still picture cannot possibly have been taken at the same time. This is, in our view, a designer continuity error that cannot have occurred by mistake. The triangular flap would have had to have been intentionally unfastened and hinged upwards and secured in an open position to be visible from the front, as is recorded in the still photograph. Our second example is from Apollo 11 on their way to the Moon, when the craft is allegedly 130,000 miles away from the Earth. This anomalous sequence was also found by a fellow TV producer and Apollo researcher, Bart Zubrell. We're all familiar with the way X-ray pictures are clipped up for examination against the light box. Well, what I'm about to show you is a sequence with a large colour transparency of the Earth clipped up against the window. If I put white behind it, you can see that more clearly. And when it's clipped up against the window, it becomes illuminated by the light of the sun behind it.
Okay, level, we have a picture. We see the Earth right in the center of the screen, over.
The astronauts are assured that F-22 is the correct exposure.
Roger, Houston, Apollo 11. Calling in from about 130,000 miles out. And we'll zoom our camera in slowly.
Here is what appears to be the Apollo 11 crew's view of the Earth across the blackness of space.
Roger.
But why would the choice be made to take this all-important first view of Earth from 130,000 miles out by standing well back, away from the window?
Could you describe what you're looking at, over? Roger, you're seeing Earth as we see it at our left-hand window, just a little more than a half Earth.
During the sequence, after the camera has zoomed in, surprisingly, something comes between the camera and the Earth, partly obscuring the view. Obviously, this could not happen if they were shooting directly out of the window. It would not then be possible for anything to get midway between the camera and the Earth.
Central America. South America becomes invisible just off beyond the terminator or inside the shadow.
And now in this wider view, there's also an interior light in the shot. How can that possibly happen? Well, in fact, all that we've just been looking at was televised live from the craft. But the camera was not looking out through the window at all. Had they been filming the real Earth from a position back from the window, it would be difficult to keep the subject well framed, as you can see from this illustration. The Earth in the far distance would be cut off by the window in the foreground when any movement of the camera occurred. We've ringed the edge of the window white for clarity. Remember, it was handheld. And if they had been filming the real Earth when zoomed in, the edge of the window would not be sharp. It would be out of focus like this and spoil the shot, because the focus would have been set at infinity. Far better to have gone right up to the window and filmed from there.
It's floodlight.
Returning to the sequence where we left off, when the lights have been switched on, the other window shade opened and the exposure adjusted, we can see astronaut Mike Collins. The left-hand window we've just been looking at is now overexposed, but as we get closer, we can see that something is indeed clipped in front of the window. Is it that window-size colour transparency of the Earth, with the sunlight glowing white behind it? It looks very much so. Why would they need to be videoing a picture of the Earth?
Maybe a bigger f-stop might help.
Continuing with the shot, we panned around past Armstrong, who is in the centre of frame, across to the right-hand side of the capsule. And here, would you believe, through the right-hand window is what appears to be the real Earth filling the view. From the Apollo 11 command module, the CSM, we're being shown two different views of Earth, but both cannot be correct. Given that the first version is purporting to be over halfway to the Moon, and on closer examination is seen to be a colour transparency, we have to conclude that this image is not a true representation of the CSM's position. However, the time recorder reads out a mission elapsed time of 34 hours and 16 minutes.
34 hours, 16 minutes, and 15 seconds. Roger, you see that clearly enough, Charlie?
Where could they be? Well, as the second view of Earth fills the craft's window, we must conclude that they're in the relative safety of low Earth orbit. and not on their way to the moon at all. That would then explain why they were videoing a picture of the distant Earth. It's worth noting that this star chart, which is obviously clipped to the window, is held there in the same manner as we suggest was the backlit transparency of the Earth we saw earlier.
The president's two star charts that he is using right now as sunshades over the right-hand window, window number 5. Roger, we see the sun shining in through it behind him. And
this sequence then, together with the jump salute, are our first two examples of whistleblowing fakery and indications to us that something's seriously wrong with the Apollo record.
Dr. David Groves is a physicist in the UK and a specialist in image processing.
I've been involved in image analysis for 25 years now. I did my PhD developing holographic computer techniques for analysing images. My company, Quantic Image Processing, use these image processing techniques to extract three-dimensional information from two-dimensional images used in industry and used in medicine. The NASA pictures that I've analysed contain many inconsistencies, a whole core of which have no rational explanation or excuse.
Not surprisingly, a growing number of intelligent thinking people are beginning to realise that all was not well with Apollo. So why aren't professionals in the aerospace industry speaking out? What could be the reason for such reticence? Well, in fact, some have spoken out. Bill Wood lives in California. He is a highly qualified scientist with degrees in mathematics, physics and chemistry. He's been granted high security clearance for a number of top secret US government projects. Wood has worked with many major contractors to the United States government, including McDonnell Douglas, and also with engineers employed on the Saturn V, the Apollo launch vehicle. For many years, Bill Wood has harboured suspicions regarding the authenticity of the Apollo record.
I think that a lot of the people that I have had contact with in the aerospace industry want desperately to believe that this actually